All right, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Justin and Benji. How's it going, Benji?
It's going good. How are you?
Good. I'm great. So it's Friday night. We haven't yet turned this into a happy hour yet, but we had a new idea for how we might structure this. We are going to read short stories and analyze them. What is your honest opinion on that approach? We haven't talked about that yet too much.
I like it. I mean, that's what I'm doing for my other podcast at Sharks and Marmots.
Tell
So
us about that.
that's what I'm doing. I'm reading stories and analyzing them. So right now I've been working on Seneca.
Did you ever listen to Alan Watt do this back in the day where he was like reading Young and stuff?
Yeah, I've heard several of those old recordings.
Cool. All right. So I'll start us off, okay? So Socrates said this. Next, said I, compare our nature in respect of education and its lack to such an experience as this. So that's kind of the preface. So then we start with part one, setting the scene, the cave and the fire. The cave, Socrates, quote, imagine this. People live under the earth in a cave-like dwelling. Stretching a long way up toward the daylight is its entrance, towards which the entire cave is gathered. The people have been in this dwelling since childhood, shackled by the legs and neck. Thus they stay in the same place so that there is only one thing for them to look at, whatever they encounter in front of their faces. But because they are shackled, they are unable to turn their heads around. Popcorn.
What's that?
I guess I remember that back in school when you used to read text aloud and you would read like a paragraph. We actually didn't discuss this. You would say popcorn and then the next person would take over. So then you would start from a fire is behind them.
Oh, okay. All right. I see. I dropped out of high school, so I don't know. A fire is behind them, and there is a wall between the fire and the prisoners. Socrates says, some light, of course, is allowed to them, namely from a fire that casts its glow toward them from behind them, being above and at some distance. Between the fire and those who are shackled, i.e. behind their backs, there runs a walkway at a certain height. Imagine that a low wall has been built the length of the walkway, like the low curtain that puppeteers pop up, over which they show their puppets. And here it lets be known that images are carried before the fire, thus casting shadows in front of the prisoners. And Socrates says, so now imagine that all along this low wall, people are carrying all sorts of things that reach up higher than the wall. Statues and other carvings made of stone or wood, and many other artifacts that people have made. As you would expect, some are talking to each other as they walk along, and some are silent. Glaucon responds, this is an unusual picture that you are presenting here, and these are unusual prisoners. And to that, Socrates says, they're very much like us, humans, he responds.
What the prisoners see and hear. Socrates, what do you think? From the beginning, people like this have never managed, whether on their own or with the help by others, to see anything besides the shadow that are continually projected on the wall opposite them by the glow of the fire. Glaucon says, how could it be otherwise, since they are forced to keep their heads immobile for their entire lives? Socrates, and what do they see of the things that are being carried along behind them? Do they not see simply these, namely the shadows? Glaucon, certainly. Socrates, now if they were able to say something about what they saw and to talk it over, do you not think that they would regard that which they saw on the wall as beings? Glaucon, they would have to. Socrates, and now what if this prison also had an echo reverberating off the wall in front of them, the one that they always and only look at? Whenever one of these people walking behind those in chains and carrying the things would make a sound, do you think the prisoners would imagine that the speaker were anyone other than the shadow passing in front of them? Glaucon, nothing else, by Zeus. Socrates, all in all, I responded, those who were chained would consider nothing besides the shadows of the artifacts as the unhidden. Glaucon, that would absolutely have to be. You want to start part two?
Let's go back and dissect it, because we kind of even glossed over the preface to the Allegory of the Cave,
Okay.
And I want to say a few words on it. The allegory of the cave is set up in book 7 of the Republic, and the Republic is absolutely one of those texts. Like I said, I couldn't even find the book. I was looking for it on my bookshelf. I'm sure I've owned it 3 or 4 or 5 times, and I've loaned it out each time and never gotten it back. But I like the point Socrates makes right here in the preface, where he says, compare our nature in respect of education and its lack of such an experience as this. So being that, and then I feel like part one, he concludes it right at the end of this section after they describe images being carried before the fire, and Glaucon says to him, that's an unusual picture you paint here, Socrates. And he says they're very much like us humans. And so we've got this awesome picture of these prisoners that are set up in such a manner that their education is entirely provided for them. And as humans, what Socrates says here, our nature in respect of education and its lack of such, I think what he's really talking about is that we need culture, and we're one of the only creatures that needs culture. I know we both like Carol Quigley. I don't know if you ever read The Evolution of Civilizations, but Carol Quigley talks quite a lot about this in the beginning of that book. And I think any historian, any social scientist, anyone that's dealing with philosophy, psychology, they're dealing with the fact that we are different than every other creature, and the fact that without culture, we're doomed. And by that, I mean a gazelle can be born and within minutes is on its way, but humans don't get that. The gestation period for humans is 9 months. And I've heard some biologists and psychologists say that should be closer to 2 years for the complexity of our brains and our size. So we're very much creatures that need to be taught. And if we're not taught, we don't make it very far in life. And that's just one, of course, variable. So yeah, I just want to bring that back to the culture aspect, because we know nothing except what we are taught. And though he does say, like, we can see shadows and assume that those shadows are beings of some sort, it really, two things Socrates points out here that are necessary for us to start a culture. One is light. We have to be able to see what we're looking at, and the other is communication. We have to discuss that with other people.
When I look at this and think about education in this context, I almost feel like a good substitute word would be for entire experience, because really in this context, the education is the entire experience of the prisoners. So it's not only what they're taught, but it's their entire reality. Also, what they experience isn't like a three-dimensional being, as is the reality from the view of the reader, but rather it's like a two-dimensional figure without any color or without any light, in a way.
Yeah, he even points out that the sound, they're not hearing the sound that they think they're hearing the sound as it's reflected off the wall. So almost an echo or a shadow of the original source of the sound.
I find it interesting too, like looking at our language a little bit closer. And in college, I think probably around the time I actually read 1984, which was not in high school when it was assigned, I started examining language, etc. And I came across a lot of texts back then that were saying that our language doesn't really help form our thought or inform our thought. And I always, in my gut, didn't think that made too much sense. So I like thinking about this word culture and kind of dissecting it. What else does it mean? So this word culture, it also refers to essentially that which is in a petri dish in a scientific lab setting. Also, the word cult is in culture. Who can experiment on these cultures? That is then experiment experts. And I wouldn't have taken this. I wouldn't have analyzed this in terms of culture until you said something along those lines. But I think that a couple points that I would make are, first of all, like, this is their entire experience. Their education is here referring to all that they experience. And then also that, to your point, what is the nature of a culture then? And is this then, this is a way of looking at culture in which I don't think many people look at it then, when you kind of look at it from the perspective of the cave.
Yeah, absolutely. And you could say even that nature has cultured us herself, which would be some very old religious and philosophical ideas about it. But what Socrates says at the very end, all in all, those who were chained would consider nothing beside the shadows of the artifacts as the unhidden. And so when talking about culture, let's talk about it in terms of childhood development. I think that's the best analogy to use. And I don't have any children, and neither do you, but I have friends that have kids, and I've studied the field a little bit. But say, for example, let's take the notion of popular myths like Santa Claus or something. A lot of there's arguments to and for, is it a lie? Is it not? Is it something that helps child development? Does it not? And it kind of gets muddied in there. But in terms of a reemerging cultural figure since well before Christianity, during the winter solstice, you have this recurring character that comes up, that comes up, that comes up. And we could sort of argue that for the child, this Santa Claus is nothing more than the shadow in front of the fire, in that the actual meaning of giving and Christmas, those concepts are a little bit too deep of an understanding for a child to really get a grasp at. So we start introducing them into more complex cultural relationships through education. So the concepts, these big virtuous concepts of giving, for example, might start out as a red man in a suit. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's a plateaued effect. If they build on one each other, because you just can't teach. And as we get into parts 2 and 3, I think I can expand on that. But you can't teach a large cultural concept without education. But that education is predicated on lots and lots of presuppositions, and those presuppositions need to be established first.
Should we get on with part 2?
Yeah, absolutely. You want to take it? A prisoner gets free?
Yeah. So part 2, 3 stages of liberation. Freedom stage 1, a prisoner gets free. Socrates. So now, I replied, watch the process whereby the prisoners are set free from their chains, and along with that, cured of their lack of insight. And likewise consider what kind of lack of insight must be if the following were to happen to those who were chained. Walked back to the fire. Socrates. Whenever any of them was unchained and was forced to stand up suddenly, to turn around, to walk, and to look up toward the light, in each case the person would be able to do this only with pain, and because of the flickering brightness would be unable to look at those things whose shadows he previously saw. Any comments on that, or do you want to keep reading?
Yeah, well, I got a couple comments. I mean, one, I really like how in stage 1 he uses the concepts and terminology of being shackled. And it's very true that, and very much so in the Western tradition, to the Western mind, that we are born into what can be conceptualized as a type of prison. And it's education that can likewise keep us imprisoned and also set us free, and especially internally. And when the man walks back to the fire, Socrates makes the point of saying that the brightness of what he sees actually causes him pain, this person pain. because previously, he'd only seen the shadows. Now he's seen a more real and direct representation. I think this concept kind of goes along with the religious concept of the voice of God will destroy you, because you're now encountering a conceptualization that encompasses all the conceptualizations you had before. But in order to do that, to bring it all together, you have to physically destroy, and neuroscience has actually proven this, you're physically destroying your conceptions that you held earlier. So your brain is actually looking for ways to reorganize the information given. And I don't know if you've ever had a personal experience with that, but it is a sensation that's certainly very, very painful on multiple levels, not the least of which are emotional. So that's all I have to say about that. Do you have anything else to say, or we can get on to question the objects?
Only thing I have to say is that there's also a biological phenomenon that mirrors this quite closely, where like if you're in the dark and you literally look into some light suddenly, that it is painful.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think we've all gone through that too, or coming out of a movie theater into a very bright day. The movie theater, you're kind of in this darkened, dreamlike, cave-like state, very similar, looking at a screen, hearing the sound behind you. When you step outside, it's like, wow, actual reality shines forth and snaps you out of that daze.
Hmm. So not always when you have a new perspective is it painful. So there's interesting. I feel like you can distinguish between those new perspectives which bring you pain and those which don't. But I think getting on to the next section is question about the objects is great. Would you like to take that?
Yeah. So the prisoner here is led up to the objects, to the fire, and to the objects in front of the fire that were casting the shadows that they had previously assumed were actual beings. And now the prisoner is questioning the objects. If all this were to happen, if all this were to happen to the prisoner, Socrates says, what do you think he would say if someone were to inform him that what he saw before were mere trifles, but that now he was much nearer to the actual beings themselves, and that as a consequence of now being turned towards what is more in being, he also saw more correctly. So his perceptions are already there. And the answer that Socrates postulates the prisoner would give, if someone were then to show him any of the things that were passing by and forced him to answer the question about what it was, don't you think that he would be a wit's end, and in addition would consider that what he previously saw with his own eyes was more unhidden than what was now being shown to him by someone else? And Glaucon says, yes, absolutely, he would think that. And then upon the prisoner looking at the firelight itself, Socrates said, and if someone even forced him to look into the glare of the fire, would his eyes not hurt him? And that's to your point, Justin, of the biological effect. And would he not then turn away and flee back? And that nicely says that would be maybe my point, is that psychological effect, because we instinctively want to get away from pain. It gives us negative emotions. So pain is very real. To that which he is capable of looking at. So I'll say it again. And if someone even forced him to look into the glare of the fire, would his eyes not hurt him? And would he not then turn away and flee back to that which he is capable of looking at? And that would be the shadows the world that he's used to. And would he not decide that what he could see before without any help was in fact clearer than what was now being shown to him? And Glaucon says, precisely, that's precisely the case.
It's like the neuronal version of the path of least resistance. When you see
Exactly.
it's
Yeah,
like
exactly.
when you see things and experience things, it leaves an imprint on your brain. So I saw a study recently by the UC Berkeley. It was an experiment, and they showed their subjects in an MRI machine a movie trailer, and then they were able to reproduce that trailer based on the reaction of their brain, the waves of their brain. through a computer program. And that's precisely, and so when you have these impressions or you have these perspectives, it's almost like they've kind of that once these connections are made, they're the path of least resistance, like a river. These like rivers of like neuronal connections we make, those are the ones that's easiest for us to kind of flow on down. And when you put a rock in that river, then like the tendency of the object or the idea is then to kind of like wiggle free and then continue along the path of least resistance, which is the prior perspective.
Yeah, I think so. Let's dive right into stage 2 because I'm getting excited here. You want to kick this one off?
Yeah, freedom stage 2. Out of the cave into daylight. Socrates. Now, however, if someone using force were to pull him who had been freed from his chains away from there and to drag him up the cave's rough and steep ascent and not to let go of him until he had dragged him out into the light of the sun, page rage blindness. So let's take a closer look at that. Now, however, if someone using force were to pull him away from there and to drag him up the cave's rough and steep ascent and not to let go of him until he had dragged him out into the light of the sun. Pay rage blindness. Socrates. Would not the one who had been dragged like this feel in the process pain and rage? And when he got into the sunlight, wouldn't his eyes be filled with the glare? And wouldn't he thus be unable to see any of the things that are now revealed to him as the unhidden? And then Glaucon replies, he would not be able to do that at all, at least not right away. Getting used to the light. Socrates. It would obviously take some getting accustomed, I think, if it should be a matter of taking into one's eyes that which is up there outside the cave in the light of the sun. Shadows and reflections. Socrates. And in this process of acclimatization, he would first and most easily be able to look at shadows and after that the images of people and the rest of things as they are reflected in water. Any comments?
Yeah, I do. You know, the pain, rage, and blindness, and just keeping with the trope of what we were talking about, that the slave when he saw the fire was inclined to go back and look at the shadows because that's what he saw. Now, to get away from the campfire and actual out into daylight entirely, someone has to force you to do that. Someone or something has to force you to do that. And that you see this trope in all sorts of societies, and this trope comes in the form of, in a lot of cultures, it comes in the form of initiation rituals where young men are put into situations, often in very dark caves, where they are, you know, frightened about half to death, and everything they've known was taken away from them. They're put into scary but controlled situations. And the argument is that women typically don't go through this because nature provides the initiation rite for them in the form of pregnancy. And in modern society, we're currently lacking both of these things. So we can draw a lot of parallels to modern society in the fact that people, because they don't have to, and there's so many safe shadows for them to run back to, people definitely aren't going to climb the stairs out of the cave if they even make it to the fire. And on top of that, if no one's using force, Socrates says it specifically. Now, however, if someone using force were to pull him away from there and drag him up the cave's rough and steep ascent, and not to let go of him until he had dragged him out into the light of the sun. So literally kicking and screaming the entire way. Yeah, those are my initial impressions of what we just went through.
Reflections are interesting. So it's almost like you go through a process of seeing the fire. You go from shadows then into reflections from water, which yet is not as clear as the actual just looking at something directly.
Right, right. Yeah, you're actually you know, in each of these analogies, I mean, we start with beings that are shadows, and then we start with beings that are in front of a fire. Then we start with beings that are reflected in the water. In each of these echelons, Socrates is letting us know that you're still not seeing what is. You're still going through the process of discovering what is. And that process is predicated on the fact that you have to take what is and establish that it isn't to go on to the next thing. And as humans, that is, it's a very it's a difficult thing for us to do on every level. And the example that comes to mind right away is Freud's example of the nuclear family and the Oedipal mother, and those break apart of where the boundaries are ignored, and then where the boundaries are artificially enforced. And at some point in time, the child has to grow up and or assert itself. So basically breaking through a boundary from the wall to the fire. And then that assertion has to meet with the parents' boundaries. They have to come to a conclusion, because the mother can't be looking down on an adult child, or that will cause a lot of hostility and resentment. So here we have to step up again. I guess the point I'm trying to make is that not this is a we could never do this by ourselves. Someone's got to initiate it. So at any point in time, someone is going to be dragging, and someone is going to be kicking and screaming their way into the light. But the idea is that once you get into the light, and let me just I'll finish, because you finished at the water reflection, right?
Yeah, and I can finish up this verse.
Yeah,
And then,
finish the last one.
yeah, cool. Socrates, looking at things directly. Socrates. Later, however, he would be able to view the things themselves, the beings, instead of the dim reflections. But within the range of such things, he might well contemplate what there is in the heavenly dome, and this dome itself more easily during the night by looking at it at the light of the stars and the moon, more easily, that is to say, than by looking at the sun and its glare during the day. Glaucon replies, certainly.
Yeah, so I love it. It's just like, so this guy gets out of the cave, or gal, you know, this can happen to anyone, and you're overwhelmed with what is. And once you understand that what is not what was, at least to your perceptions, then you can start to act. It's like you're in a whole new conceptual environment to your psychology. And after you're done being terrified by it, you're finally in a position to work it to your own advantage. And you know, even to the point where you can, instead of staring at the sun, like he says, you can stare at night. You can use the different beings to your own advantage, and you can pick and choose what's going to work best for your personality. And I really like that.
All right, great. So I guess we'll go now to freedom, stage 3, the sun.
Yeah. So what was stage 2? Stage 2 didn't have a subtitle. Stage 1 didn't have a subtitle. So freedom, stage 1, stage 2, the sun is the sun title of stage 3. I don't know if that's my Stanford edition or not. But in terms of looking, the prisoner is now looking at the sun itself, and Socrates says, that was probably a religious slip right there, huh? And Socrates says, but I think that finally he would be in the condition to look at the sun itself, not just at its reflection, whether in water or wherever else it might appear, but at the sun itself, as it is in and of itself, and in the place proper to it, and to contemplate of what sort it is. And Glaucon, because This is a Socratic method. You can't say no. So Glaucon says it would necessarily happen this way. Now the prisoner is starting to think about the sun itself, its nature and functions. Right? Because this is what freedom can do. Because in going way back, when you're shackled and you can only look at the wall of the cave, you don't have the freedom to become your own agent in the environment you're exploring. Now that he's out in the sun and in the whole real world and not in that small cave, it's like, man, the potentialities are just limitless. So did you want to say something?
No.
Okay. So having done all that, by this time, this is Socrates, by this time he would also be able to gather the following about the sun. First, that it is that which grants both the seasons and the years. Second, it is that which governs whatever there is in the now visible region of sunlight. And third, that is also the cause of all those things that the people dwelling in the cave have before their eyes in some way or other. So he's gone to the source. This is like in the Matrix when he's like finding the machine city. Glaucon says it is obvious that he would get to these things, the sun and whatever stands in its light, after he had gone out beyond those previous things, the merely reflections and shadows. Moving on?
Yeah, I'll take it from here. Thoughts about the cave. Socrates. And then what? If he again recalled his first dwelling and the knowing that passes as the norm there, and the people with whom he once was chained, don't you think he would consider himself lucky because of the transformation that had happened, and by contrast feel sorry for them? Glaucon says very much so. What counts for wisdom in the cave? Socrates. However, what if among the people in the previous dwelling place, the cave, certain honors and commendations were established for whomever most clearly catches sight of what passes by, and also best remembers which of them normally is brought by first, which one later, and which ones at the same time? And what if there were honors for whoever could most easily foresee which one might come by next? Keep on going.
Yeah, hit it.
What would the liberated prisoner now prefer? Socrates. Do you think the one who had gotten out of the cave would still envy those within the cave and would want to compete with them who are esteemed and who have power? Or would not he or she much rather wish for the condition that Homer speaks of, namely, to live on the land above ground as the paid menial of another destitute peasant? Would he or she prefer to put up with absolutely anything else rather than associate with those opinions that hold in the cave and be that kind of human being? Glaucon. I think that he would prefer to endure everything rather than be that kind of human being.
And who wouldn't? Not me.
What do you mean by that?
So I think this it goes back to an example I talk a lot about. It's just because it's comical to me, and Jordan Peterson brings it up. I can't remember if it's in the Harvard lectures or the Toronto personality lectures about Ron Jeremy, and Ron Jeremy being sort of the king of the scumbags, and then the other, you can look at this in Pinocchio too, that king of the Lost Boys. And so what Glaucon is agreeing to Socrates is that, all right, so you escaped the cave, and then you got past the next various obstacles. You got through the objects, you got through the fire, you got through the steep and rough ascent. Maybe you came to terms with the person that was dragging you, kicking and screaming, because no doubt you resented that person for quite a long time. Here's another great example of that. I'm sure many people have seen the movie V for Vendetta, when Natalie Portman is put in the prison cell, and this is the cultural initiation rite that V was giving her, because she was naive and she did not understand. So V put her through the entire thing, and as soon as she got out of the prison and figured out what had been done to her, did she hate the forces that had caused V to be the way he is and to show her these forces in such a way? Not really. She hated V himself. So in the movie, she cuts her hair, which is actually pretty brilliant symbolically, and she goes back out into the world. And it isn't until much later that she comes to terms with the fact that V had done her a big favor, because it doesn't feel that way. And here again and again, Socrates tells us that our feelings and what is are two separate things, and our feelings can compel us in the wrong direction. But once we figure out what is and we become free agents in our sort of behavioral environment or our personality development, then we are able to actually, then our feelings actually become much more genuine and in line with our actions. And they're not false pleasures, they're actual pleasures. So the prisoners that are in the cave passing around laurels and medals and saying, oh, you're so smart, you're the wisest people. Well, these are the people that are masturbating to Ron Jeremy. These are the lost boys that are following Pinocchio around the grand casino of the world. It's not that you should be particularly proud of that, because you in many ways, you're king of the lie. You're king of the great lie, the great deception. And so you can be proud of yourself for that. But Socrates and Glaucon are both saying, why would you be? And then they cite Homer. And I mean, how far back can you go in the very concretized written Western tradition? And Homer is definitely one of the first big ones we have. And Homer says, wouldn't you rather live on the land under the sun, so to speak, as the paid menial or servant of another destitute peasant? So wouldn't you rather be the lowest of the low, but still have freedom of thought and action, than to be shackled in a cave, even if you were king down there in the cave? Because even as the lowest of the low above ground, the cave is even more constricting than that.
In 1984, when Winston and Julie are being interrogated by Big Brother, there's a line in there where basically Winston tells Julia that even if she confesses about what they've done, that's not the ultimate betrayal. Stopping to love him is the ultimate betrayal. So
Yes.
like you said, wouldn't you rather have the free thought than not? It's similar to, like, would you not rather have command of your own emotions than not?
Yeah, and that's certainly the Greek perspective, and the Greek perspective was built on at least thousands of years of thought before that. And me in my personal life, I would say absolutely. Most of my 20s and very early 30s and teenage years, I think, we both said that high school wasn't our favorite, and we both said that college wasn't our favorite. And it was like, why? And one of the weird parts about living in the modern world is I don't see anyone dragging anybody kicking and screaming into reality. And so one of the difficult things that maybe, and I shouldn't say the modern world, but maybe just this echelon in time, you don't see it happening. It doesn't happen. And in fact, it seems like we're going the other way. It's like, oh, well, if you're depressed and anxious, let's medicate that. And as a result, because I've been really active on social media and trying to get more active socially in general since I've been a hermit for so long, and I see it all the time at the first level of analysis. One of the things, might have been Socrates. I don't want to misquote it. So, but you said to the wise, life is a solution, no a problem. Yeah, there it is. Sorry, I was reading my search cues. Let's make sure who said it. Marcus Aurelius. Okay, so much later. To the wise, life is a problem. To the fool, it's a solution. And so what Marcus Aurelius has given us a brilliant summary of the cave. The slaves are foolish because they think that the wall is simply it's everything. And to the wise person has gone through the slings and arrows and has chosen to be rather than not to be. And I really love it. It's the ultimate enlightenment, and it's true. There's no greater happiness, but you can't convince people of that. They have to experience it. And that can be a really, really tough part, because like we said, going back to the beginning, people don't want to. It's not in their purview, and no one's forcing them to, especially especially not modern educational systems, we could say.
Mm. Certainly questioning the biggest myth is one of the kind of most is considered almost like breaking the social contract in a way. So by questioning the largest myths that we tell ourselves as a people, as a culture, as a society, about where we come from, about how things are ordered, questioning the very nature of one's environment or society itself is um, almost like treason.
It's shunned. Yeah, it's definitely shunned, because as humans, we, as you know, like, we're always bouncing. This goes back to our point of culture. We exist because of culture. If we don't have anyone to validate our own thoughts within our conscious mind, they tend to run amok and get chaotic, and that can lead to a lot of really serious pathologies. So when you are the person in the room, and there's always only one, and I'll cite Christianity, I'll cite the Matrix movies, I'll cite the V for Vendetta movie. It's a really old story, and the iterations don't stop, because everyone else in the room is validating each other, and then you have one anomaly, and that anomaly is the person that's dragging you, kicking and screaming. But what happens is, when you have when like when the prisoner saw the fire first, he ran back to the shadows, and he wasn't going past the fire until he was forced to do so. So you're dealing with our internal psychologies that are rooted in emotions, evolutionarily, we could say. And those emotions are really powerful motivators, and they do a really good job of keeping us alive up to a certain point. But it does reach a point of diminishing returns, so that the king of the slaves staring at the wall, yeah, I mean, he's entertained, he's watching a movie, he's seen some shadows, he's got some nifty stories. But the guy that went all the way up above ground, that saw the stars, that saw reflections in water, that looked at the sun, that realized that without the sun being up there in the essence of the forms, I suppose the Platonic philosophers would say that truth shines through all other truths, even down into the depths of the cave. So I really like it. I really like this story.
I find it interesting that the prisoners get rewards, etc., which is something that to which they can become emotionally attached. And then being climbed up out of the cave, then they have to give up that prior reward system and where they were deriving meaning and purpose. I also think it's interesting to know too, because like when you get up above ground here, you can see the stars and the moon. Many of us live in cities today, so when you're outside, you're not able to see the stars and the moon, which then could make our cities the cave itself.
Yeah, absolutely. That's that's I think that's about as valid point as you can get. And like, to take it back to the Matrix, the second two Matrix movies get a really bad rap, and they're actually my favorite. And
Ooh,
because I'm
we
always
have
that
to
guy in
do
the room.
in the future. We're gonna do reviews of those two movies, but just 2 and 3, Matrix 2 and 3, not one.
Dude, oh, that piss everyone off, because they're really in the same. I don't know. Have you watched Battlestar Galactica?
I have, but long time ago, before I would have picked up on anything of meaning.
Well, it's worth it, because it's, again, the second two seasons were kind of this. So the violence or physical action dies down a little bit and becomes much more of a philosophical and political drama than an action. Everyone loses interest and they hate it, but that's where the gems are. That's where the gems really are. And the second, and and then I'm going to get into blindness in the debate, and then you can kill it with the final outcome in part 3, the prisoner returns to the cave, because this is what happens to Neo in the third Matrix movie. At the end of the second Matrix movie, they're outside their ship and they're on land and they're running around, and I can't remember who, might have been Trinity, asks him what's wrong, and he goes, something's wrong, I can feel them. And he turns around and he can actually see and engage with the machines for the first time. So we could say that in the first Matrix, when we think that he's getting unplugged out of this egg and all these things is going through, and then they're plugging him back in, this is his interplay between the cave wall, the objects that are shadows on the cave wall, the fire, and then his echelon coming out. And when he, at the end of the second movie, it's like when he leaves the ship and he's there, it's like he sees the sun. And I don't know if you remember exactly what happened, but it's just like it hits him, and then like the movie's over. And they do a good job of describing the pain of realization that happens, because he had already thought this whole big world had opened up to him, and he wasn't even close, much less was he to the machine city, which was another, say, echelon away. I think the Matrix, maybe it's arguable that they considered the machine city the sun itself, but you could say the architect too.
So then, are you arguing that, and up until that point, he's staring at the reflection in the water at best?
At best, yeah. Maybe that we could say that that's a reflection of the water, because he was adept. He had interacted with many of the computer programs. He had interacted with Merovingian and then the vampires, and so all sorts. So his world in the second movie was way bigger than the first movie. But again, yes, still like a mere reflection. Like he hadn't talked to any of the big ones, you know? Absolutely.
All right, let's kill this.
All right, let's finish it out. So here, this happens in every enlightenment journey, right? And the Buddha comes to mind, because Buddha goes through enlightenment and reaches nirvana, and then Buddha goes back to the cave, so to speak. But he goes back to the cave with knowledge. So this is what the prisoner is doing. The prisoner's been up on land for, well, who knows how long, and he's been tilling the land as the lowest of the low, but it's still way better for being in the cave. And I think there's a natural human sentiment. Like, I know for me, a lot, like, I've always wanted to help people. I've always wanted to flesh out the best in people. And, you know, like Socrates, I think most people in my life haven't liked that. And I was thinking about, for Sharks and Marmots, doing a talk on that, and maybe I will right after that since it's fresh. But let's just, the return is captioned blindness, and Socrates says, and now consider this: if this person who had gotten out of the cave were to go back down again and sit in the same place as before, would he not find in that case, coming suddenly out of the sunlight, that his eyes are filled with darkness? And Glaucon says, yes, very much so, because the fire doesn't cut it anymore. It's nothing compared to the brilliance of the sun. And then the hypothesis is that this prisoner would start, it's called a debate. I don't necessarily like that terminology, because I really think of this in terms of enlightenment as trying to draw people. Now that you've been out to see the sun, you're the one dragging these people kicking and screaming, but you do it out of compassion. You do it to help them ultimately. Now, if once again, this is Socrates, along with those who had remained shackled there, the freed person had to engage in the business of asserting and maintaining opinions about the shadows. I'll talk about later. While his eyes are still weak and before they have readjusted, an adjustment that would require him quite a bit of time. Would he not then be exposed to ridicule down there? And would they not let him know that he had gone up, but only in order to come back down into the cave with his eyes ruined? And thus, it certainly does not pay to go up. Take it away, Justin. Kill it.
And the final outcome: Socrates, And if they can get hold of this person who takes it in hand to free them from their chains and to lead them up, and if they could kill him, will they not actually kill him? Glaucon replies, they certainly will.
Yeah, it's absolutely brilliant. And if anyone's listening, go on YouTube, listen to book 5, chapter 5 of The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, when the Grand Inquisitor throws Jesus into prison and says, not only will I kill you in public tomorrow, but all the people that you are trying to save will cheer me on. It's an incredibly profound. I love Greek. I love the Greek renditions of these stories because they're very concise. You could say they're very, to the discerning Western mind, they're very boiled down to the gist, to the gist, to the gist. My love for Russian literature is that, this 6 pages would some take about an hour to read aloud.
I wonder if they have kind of the similar concept as we have here in English that, from what I understand, was developed by Hemingway, where they've got like 7/8 of the iceberg under the water here. So, in other words, the story should only be 1/8 of the iceberg, and the rest should be unspoken.
I I firmly, 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 firmly do agree with you on that, and I think a lot of the ancients felt that way, and it was out of necessity because it was hard to write things down, and in many parts of the world it was not possible at all. Everything was done by memory, so the conciseness of it was absolutely essential. And I wonder, now that you mention it, because I didn't know that, so that's very interesting. I wonder if in some way Hemingway was reacting to the serial journalists of like the Romantic era, and Dickinson just filling page after page, and Dumas filling page after page, and though I really did enjoy those books, man, they take a long time to get through, and life is short. So I think Hemingway was certainly onto them, and he's definitely one of my favorite authors. And now that you mention it, yeah, his short stories especially really, really accomplished that goal. And yeah, you said a lot without saying it. So I appreciate that insight because I haven't thought about it like that. But yeah, I think you're totally right.
So also, I want to say it's interesting about this, the ending here, so that if the other prisoners could get a hold of the one who had been freed and gone over ground, they would kill him. And some figures in recent history that come to mind then are like Bonhoeffer during 1930s and 40s Germany, where he kind of continued practicing Christianity and also opposed the Nazi state quite openly before being hanged. I forget much of their philosophy, but the White Rose during that time as well, Sophie, I forget her name, Sophie Rose maybe, was also then, I believe she had the guillotine, but maybe that was just a movie. So let's see what her name is.
Yeah, it could be. I'm not familiar with it. I'm more familiar with.
Sophie Scholl.
Okay. And we're talking 1930s Germany?
1940s. Both met their demise in 1940s Germany. So then, for instance, Sophie, I believe, was executed by guillotine in 1943. At this point, then the Nazis knew that it was very unlikely that they would win the war, and had already then began looting of the countries they had invaded, and in some cases sending the loot to like South America.
Yeah, I knew about that. I mean, there was massive
So then they also
trade going on with South America already, so the shipping lanes were already there. Wait, what were you saying?
So it seems that like at their most desperate was when they started killing the most. So at least these two met their demise after the Nazis already, like, it's generally considered, knew they had lost the war.
Yeah. Well, and and this is let's take it back to so I mentioned the Buddha, and then I mentioned the Grand Inquisitor scene in the Brothers K. And we can talk about what happened to, because right here, obviously, we can say that Jesus was this figure in the Christian thought process of how enlightenment happened and what they went through. And before and Jesus goes back to Rome, and what do? They kill him. And we're going to call, because you had a brilliant analogy earlier of the city being the cave, and I very much think of like the big architecture that was Rome, and all its politics was very much the same way. And Jesus is talking to Pontius Pilate, and it's one of my favorite scenes in the Bible, because he gets this incredibly glib response. And Pontius Pilate, and Jesus says, "I am the way, I am the light, I am the truth." And Pontius Pilate just looks at him and says, "What is truth?" And it's an amazingly glib response, because what Pontius Pilate is saying is the same thing the Grand Inquisitor was saying. And he's saying the truth is what I make it, is what the state makes it. And that's very much what the rest of the Republic is about. But we'll leave that as an aside, because the Romans take Jesus out and they crucify him. And let's just talk about, again, the final outcome in the cave. Like, we don't know how old these stories are. They're really freaking old. And Socrates asked Glaucon, just like the Inquisitor, just like Pontius Pilate, if they can get hold of this person who takes it in hand to free them from their chains and lead them up, and if they could kill them, will they not actually kill him? And Glaucon says they certainly will. So the understanding that the Greeks had about human nature was obviously very well instituted. We hear about the Freuds and etc. And of course, they were very brilliant people in a modern line of thinking. But the psychology of how people are and how they go through life is all here in these 6 pages, and a baker's dozen worth of paragraphs and very simple dialogue. And you can just unpack it forever, forever, forever.
So we don't know if the escaped prisoner or the surface prisoner survives or perishes.
We kind of do, and at least in story form, because in the Matrix, what happens? He goes in the Matrix, he's talking to the architect. The architect is the figure of Pontius Pilate, or the figure of the Grand Inquisitor, like we were saying in religious terms earlier. And he goes back into the cave, and who is waiting for him is Smith, Agent Smith, the common moniker. So basically everyone. And the example I gave, that there's always 10 people in the room and they're all the same because they've bounced the sanity off of each other, that's what Agent Smith was representing. And in the Matrix, they do kill him, but the idea that existed was enough to propagate forth that there was still choice involved in being human. So I think that just relays in terms of modern context, that we don't have the initiation rites anymore per se, and we've actually gone quite out of our way to get rid of a lot of them. Now we have, people are dying of peanut dust because they've never been exposed to it, is a very, very good way. So it's we actually, suffering is the state of humanity, and you have 2 options. You can choose to alleviate that in such a way that people never have to confront it, in which case they'll stay at the bottom of the cave giving each other crowns and laurels. Or you can tell people that that's it, go confront it, and even if you don't want to, I will kick you in the ass and make you do it. And those are the 2 ways. It's just such a brilliant story. It's just so concise and wrapped up.
I would propose there's a third way, but generally we are given this kind of duality. And like the first way in which you said reminds me of sort of the Brave New World model, where like people are given drugs in order to enjoy their subservience. And the latter way then I mean, that's an alternative model that maybe does that crop up more in like Orwell?
Uh, no, I mean, I think Orwell was pretty pessimistic. I mean, if you're talking about 1984 and Winston was sort of traveling that in that direction, but Orwell was saying in that scenario that it was already set up for him. I think the latter tradition is in more of a religious or philosophical perspective that life is suffering. It's more of an existential sort of claim, you know, and so it is. It's the Western tradition that I know the most is that you even if here, let's put it this way. uh Remember, so he's talking to the architect, Neo's talking to the architect, and there's all the cameras all around him showing him every single potential response that he could possibly give. And so there's only so many paths, but what the architect could never figure out, like he said, they're on the sixth iteration of the Matrix or something, you can never figure out which one of those Neo would pick. So there's a certain random element to that, and that's why I would call it more of a phenomenal or existential or religious claim than an Orwellian claim, because Orwell was of the assumption, I think in 1984, that choice would be successfully eradicated in all things. And I think he made the point most clearly when he said that, because Brave New World was very different than this. In 1984, he said that even at least in the movie version, I can't remember in the book, but in the movie version, you weren't allowed to orgasm. It was very much anti-state, and it kind of, to a lot of, I think, modern people, it seemed funny and ridiculous because we've gone so far down the other road. But one of the main places that people make their choices is in their relationships and who they bond with. And what happens is that now you've introduced something in Orwell's 1984 that comes between the state and that person's decisions. And quite clearly, Winston, who was maybe not a content worker, but would not have done anything different, presumably, unless he met the female protagonist that you would say that generated different choice choosing mechanisms within his psyche.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a wrap. I enjoyed this a lot. We read Plato, The Allegory of the Cave.
This felt a lot more natural to me. I mean, I didn't know how to answer the question at the beginning of the content, or at the beginning of the podcast, but I think this felt pretty natural to me. You have a lot of more political insights than I do, and I really like that because it draws out it grounds these sort of metaphysical
I'd say they're like
notions.
historical insights, but definitely we're coming from this at different from different perspectives, which is interesting.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. And I guess, like, yeah, I just meant, yeah, historically, like, yeah, political in the sense that we're conducting ourselves in one another. And you're right, the historical part is so important. And I think that's why I brought up Quigley earlier, is that we have a historic basis for this, and that's what the architect was also telling Neo. Like, to a degree, there's constraints that are humanity, but we don't necessarily know. There's almost an infinite. It's the gas problem with physics, the volume problem. You know, we know that the gas molecules will fill out that container, but we wouldn't necessarily know where they all are. But they're in that container, and that's how I view humanity. It's in a certain container, but it's really hard to get into what is being human in consciousness. But yeah, this stuff I really enjoy it. and I really enjoyed discussing hashing it out with you. It's really cool.
I look forward to next week.
Yeah, buddy. Sounds good.